Good Girl, Gracie Growler by Hilda Offen. Meet your new brother, Gracie, said Mrs. Growler. His name's Tommy. Would you like to give him a present? Asked Mr. Growler. Yes, said Gracie. He can have my rabbit. Mr. and Mrs. Growler loved their baby. See how tiny his toes are, said Mr. Growler. Careful, Gracie, said Mrs. Growler. You're treading on Tommy's rattle. The Growlers watched the baby all the time. What dear little whiskers he has, said Mrs. Growler. Oh, look, said Mr. Growler. He's smiling. It's his very first smile. One morning, the baby stopped smiling and started to cry. He howled and howled and howled. We'll take him for a walk, said Mrs. Growler. Look at me, called Gracie. Shh, said Mrs. Growler. Tommy's quietening down. You'll start him off again. Suddenly, the baby opened his mouth as wide as he could. He's trying to show us something, said Mr. Growler. It's his first tooth, cried Mrs. Growler. Tommy's got his first tooth. What a clever little chap, said Mr. Growler. Not long after this, Grandma Growler came to visit. Look what I can do, said Gracie. Very nice, dear, said Gran. Now where's my best boy? He's over there, said Gracie. Tommy, called Gran. Give your old grandma a cuddle. She hugged the baby and kissed him on the nose. Come in and have a cup of tea, said Mr. Growler. Grandma put Tommy down on the carpet. He's so sweet, she said. All at once the baby shot forward. Just look at that, said Mr. Growler. Our Tommy's learned to crawl. Well done, Tommy, they said. You clever, clever boy. People were always calling around to see the baby. One summer's day, Mr. and Mrs. Lion strolled up the garden path. Auntie Rose, Uncle Joe, called Gracie. See what I've learned to do. Good for you, Gracie, they said. Where's your little brother? We brought him a jumpsuit. The lions watched while Mrs. Growler dressed the baby in his new outfit. What a handsome child, said Mrs. Lion. Tommy stood up. He lifted one foot, then another. Would you believe it? Cried Mrs. Growler. Our Tommy's learned to walk. Everyone started to clap. Hip, hip, hooray, they shouted. While they were clapping and cheering, the baby opened his mouth. He spoke, gasped Mrs. Growler. Tommy spoke. I think he said Mum. No, dearest, he said Dad, said Mr. Growler. I thought he said Auntie Rose, said Auntie Rose. It was definitely Uncle Joe, said Uncle Joe. But Gracie heard what Tommy really said. She jumped on her bike and rode away down the street to the park. There was a lot to do before she could go home. As she cycled back through the gate, the baby shouted out loud. This time, everyone heard what he said. There was no mistake about it. Gracie, yelled baby Tommy. The grown-ups stared in surprise. Gracie walks on walls, shouted the baby. Gracie walks on clotheslines. Gracie rides upside down on bikes. Gracie does tricks on swings. Well, I never, said Mr. Growler. Can you really do all those things, Gracie? Gracie rescued my rabbit, roared the baby. Good heavens, said Mr. and Mrs. Growler. They gave Gracie a great big hug. You clever thing, they said. You good, good girl. Well done. Gracie, Gracie, shouted the baby. I want Gracie. Gracie took his hand. Come on, Tommy, she said. I'll teach you how to walk on a wall. The end.